September 19, 1863 dawn. Dense fog blankets the forests of northwest Georgia near Chickamauga Creek. The name comes from a Cherokee word meaning river of death, and over the next 2 days, that name will prove horrifyingly prophetic. Through the mist, over 120,000 soldiers are maneuvering blindly through thick woods, neither side certain where the enemy is, both armies colliding unexpectedly in a landscape where visibility extends barely 50 yards. What begins as confused skirmishing between advance units will explode within hours into one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. A 2-day nightmare of close-quarters combat in dense forest where regiments fire into each other at point-blank range, where the smoke from thousands of muskets mixes with the fog to create impenetrable darkness even at midday, where soldiers fight and die without ever seeing the enemy clearly. By the time the guns fall silent on September 20th, over 34,000 men will be casualties, more than 3,969 of them dead. Chickamauga will become the second bloodiest battle of the entire Civil War, surpassed only by Gettysburg, and it will be the Confederacy's last major victory in the Western theater, a triumph so costly that it will ultimately contribute to Southern defeat. The battlefield itself is a nightmare of terrain. The forests of northwest Georgia in 1863 are dense second-growth timber, thick underbrush, and tangled vegetation that makes coordinated military maneuvers nearly impossible. There are few roads, and those that exist are little more than dirt tracks that turn to mud. Chickamauga Creek winds through the area, creating natural obstacles. Small hills and ridges provide some elevated positions, but visibility from even these heights is limited by the forest canopy. The landscape favors defenders and chaos. Artillery cannot be positioned effectively because there are no clear fields of fire. Cavalry is almost useless in the dense woods. Infantry units quickly lose cohesion, with regiments becoming separated from their brigades, companies cut off from their regiments. Command and control, always difficult in Civil War battles, becomes nearly impossible. Officers cannot see their own units, let alone coordinate with adjacent formations. Runners carrying orders get lost in the woods. The fog of war is literal at Chickamauga, a disorienting combination of actual fog, gunpowder smoke, and forest that reduces battle to confused, desperate fighting at close range. This was a battle that neither side particularly wanted to fight, at least not here, not now, not like this. The strategic situation had been developing for months. After the fall of Vicksburg in July 1863, which gave the Union control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in two, the focus of the war in the West shifted to Tennessee. Union General William Rosecrans commanded the Army of the Cumberland, approximately 58,000 men, with orders to capture Chattanooga, a vital railroad junction that served as the gateway to the Deep South. Chattanooga's fall would open the way for Union forces to invade Georgia and strike at the heart of the Confederacy. Confederate General Braxton Bragg commanded the Army of Tennessee, approximately 65,000 men, including reinforcements rushed from Virginia, with orders to defend Chattanooga at all costs. Through brilliant maneuvering in late August and early September, Rosecrans had forced Bragg to abandon Chattanooga without a fight, a humiliating retreat that infuriated Confederate leadership and President Jefferson Davis. But Bragg was not defeated, merely withdrawing to concentrate his forces. He planned to draw Rosecrans into Georgia, then turn and destroy the Union Army while it was scattered and vulnerable. By mid-September 1863, both armies were maneuvering through the mountains and valleys of northwest Georgia, each trying to gain advantage, neither fully aware of the other's positions. Rosecrans had made a critical mistake. Believing Bragg was retreating in disorder, he had spread his army across 40 miles of mountainous terrain, with his 3 corps separated by ridges and poor roads that made mutual support nearly impossible. His corps commanders were moving through mountain passes, probing for the retreating Confederates, unaware that Bragg had concentrated his entire army and was planning to strike. Bragg's strategy was to attack the isolated Union Corps one at a time, destroying them before they could reunite. He planned to cross Chickamauga Creek, get between Rosecrans and Chattanooga, cut the Union supply lines, and force Rosecrans to fight at a disadvantage or retreat in disorder. It was a sound plan that could have resulted in the complete destruction of the Union Army, but execution failed repeatedly due to confusion, poor communication, and subordinate generals who didn't follow orders or arrived late to their positions. The two armies stumbled into each other on September 18th when Confederate cavalry encountered Union infantry near Reed's Bridge over Chickamauga Creek. Skirmishing began immediately as both sides tried to determine the enemy's strength and positions. Through the night of September 18th-19th, both armies moved into position in darkness, guided by the sounds of the earlier fighting, neither commanding general fully understanding what was developing. Rosecrans, finally realizing he had concentrated Confederate army in front of him rather than a retreating enemy, frantically ordered his scattered corps to concentrate near Chickamauga Creek. His corps marched through the night, exhausted soldiers moving as quickly as possible toward the sound of the guns, knowing that everything depended on reaching the battlefield before Bragg could destroy the isolated Union units. Bragg ordered his army to cross Chickamauga Creek at multiple points and attack at dawn on September 19th, intending to sweep around the Union left flank, cut Rosecrans off from Chattanooga, and destroy the Union army piece by piece. It was a race against time. Would the Union forces concentrate fast enough to present a unified defense? Would the Confederates coordinate their attacks effectively enough to achieve breakthrough before Union reinforcements arrived? The answer would be determined in the dense Georgia forests along Chickamauga Creek, in a battle where tactical plans would matter far less than the courage and endurance of individual soldiers fighting blindly through smoke and forest. September 19, 1863, 7:30 a.m. The battle begins not with a coordinated assault, but with a chance encounter in the fog. Union Brigadier General John Croxton's brigade, sent to investigate reports of Confederate cavalry, collides with Confederate infantry from General Nathan Bedford Forrest's dismounted cavalry and General W.H.T. Walker's infantry division near Jay's Mill. The fighting erupts instantly and viciously. Soldiers fire into each other at ranges of 30 to 40 yards, barely able to see their targets through the fog and forest. Within minutes, the engagement escalates as both sides rush reinforcements toward the sound of gunfire. Bragg's plan for a coordinated dawn attack along the entire line dissolves into chaos as his divisions, unable to see each other or communicate effectively, engage piecemeal wherever they encounter Union forces. The battle becomes a series of separate, desperate fights in the woods rather than the organized assault Bragg had envisioned. The fighting on the Union left flank intensifies throughout the morning. Confederate General John Bell Hood's division, recently arrived from Virginia with General James Longstreet's corps, attacks through the forest with the ferocity that had made Hood famous at 2nd Manassas and Gettysburg. His Texans and Georgians slam into Union positions, driving forward despite horrific casualties. The combat is savage and intimate. Soldiers fire, reload, fire again, until their rifle barrels become too hot to touch. When ammunition runs out, they fix bayonets. When regiments collide in the smoke, men fight with rifle butts, knives, even fists. The wounded crawl back through the underbrush or lie where they fall, calling for help that often doesn't come. Medical aid is nearly impossible to provide. Stretcher bearers can't navigate the dense forest. Field hospitals fill with wounded faster than surgeons can operate. The forest floor becomes slick with blood. Bodies pile up behind trees where soldiers sought cover. And still the fighting continues hour after hour, neither side gaining decisive advantage, both feeding more men into the maelstrom. By midday on September 19th, the battle has spread along a 4-mile front, but it remains a confused, fragmented series of engagements rather than a unified battle. Union General George Thomas, commanding the Union center and left, fights desperately to hold his positions against repeated Confederate assaults. Thomas, who would earn the nickname Rock of Chickamauga for his performance over the next 2 days, demonstrates exactly why he was considered one of the Union's finest generals. He shifts his divisions expertly, rushing reinforcements to threatened points, personally directing artillery fire. Inspiring his soldiers by his calm presence, even as Confederate attacks threaten to break through. His lines bend but don't break. Regiments are driven back, but then counterattack and retake their positions. At one point, Colonel John Wilder's brigade, armed with new Spencer repeating rifles that could fire 7 shots without reloading, unleashes devastating volleys that stop an entire Confederate division cold. The Confederates fall back, regroup and attack again. The pattern repeats throughout the day. Attack, repulse, counterattack, stalemate. On the Union right flank, General Thomas Crittenden's corps holds against probing Confederate attacks, but doesn't face the intense pressure that Thomas is experiencing. Rosecrans, establishing his headquarters at the Widow Glen House near the center of his line, tries to coordinate his army's defense, but communication is nearly impossible. Messengers take hours to deliver orders through the dense forest. Reports from division commanders are often outdated by the time they reach headquarters. Rosecrans can hear the roar of battle at various points along his line, but can't see what's happening. He makes decisions based on incomplete, contradictory information, sometimes reinforcing positions that have already fallen or withdrawing troops from sectors that are about to be attacked. The same problems plague Bragg on the Confederate side. His attacks are uncoordinated, with divisions assaulting at different times rather than simultaneously, allowing Union forces to shift troops and meet each threat individually. The battle becomes a test of endurance rather than tactics, a brutal slugging match where victory will go to whichever army can absorb more punishment. As darkness falls on September 19th, the fighting gradually subsides, not because either side has achieved its objectives, but because soldiers are too exhausted to continue. They have been fighting for over 12 hours in oppressive heat, thick smoke, and dense forest. Regiments that entered battle with 400 men are down to 200 or fewer. Some units have lost 50% of their strength. The forest floor is carpeted with casualties. The wounded cry out for water, for help, for their mothers. Both armies hold roughly the positions they occupied at midday, despite hours of vicious combat. Neither Bragg nor Rosecrans has achieved breakthrough, but the casualty counts are staggering. Over 16,000 men have been killed, wounded, or captured on the first day alone, and both commanding generals know the battle will resume in the morning. Rosecrans spends the night shortening his line, concentrating his forces, positioning his divisions in a north-south line along Lafayette Road, the main route back to Chattanooga. He knows he must hold this road or his army will be trapped. Thomas's corps holds the left, Crittenden holds the right, and General Alexander McCook's corps serves as reserve. Rosecrans issues orders for September 20th. Hold the line at all costs. Bragg also reorganizes during the night, but his reorganization is more fundamental and more risky. General James Longstreet, Robert E. Lee's most trusted corps commander, has arrived from Virginia with additional reinforcements, bringing Confederate strength to approximately 65,000 men. Bragg reorganizes his entire army into 2 wings. Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk will command the right wing with orders to attack the Union left at dawn, turning the Union flank and cutting off retreat to Chattanooga. Longstreet will command the left wing and attack the Union right once Polk has engaged the enemy, exploiting any weaknesses or opportunities that develop. It's a simple plan. Attack the Union left with overwhelming force Rosecrans to commit his reserves, then strike the weakened Union right and break through. In theory, it could work. In practice, it requires perfect timing and coordination, qualities that had been absent on September 19th. Neither Bragg nor Longstreet knows the exact Union positions. Neither has reliable maps of the forest terrain. Neither can communicate quickly with division commanders once battle is joined. They are planning to execute a complex flanking maneuver in dense forest where visibility is measured in yards. The stage is set for September 20th, a day that will see some of the most intense combat of the entire Civil War and will produce one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in American military history. September 20th, 1863 dawn. Bragg's plan begins to unravel immediately. General Polk's wing is supposed to attack the Union left at daybreak, but Polk doesn't receive the orders until well after sunrise due to a breakdown in communication. The attack doesn't begin until 9:30 a.m. hours behind schedule. But when Polk's divisions finally assault George Thomas's positions, the attack comes with tremendous force. Wave after wave of Confederate infantry emerge from the forest, battle flags flying, rebel yells echoing through the trees. They slam into Thomas's lines with shocking violence. The Union soldiers, exhausted from the previous day's fighting and having had little sleep, nevertheless hold firm. Thomas has positioned his divisions expertly, using the terrain to create strong defensive positions. His artillery is positioned to enfilade attacking Confederate formations. His infantry is deployed in depth, with fresh regiments ready to counterattack any Confederate breakthrough. For the next 3 hours, Polk's wing attacks repeatedly, each assault more desperate than the last, and each time Thomas's men hold, though at terrible cost. The fighting on the Union left reaches levels of intensity that shock even Civil War veterans who have seen combat at Shiloh and Stones River. Confederate division, considered one of the finest in the Confederate Army, attacks Thomas's position at Horseshoe Ridge. Cleburne's men advance through withering fire, closing to within 30 yards of Union lines before being driven back by concentrated volleys. They reform and attack again and again. Some Confederate regiments make 5 or 6 separate charges against the same Union positions, each time losing hundreds of men, each time being repulsed. The ground in front of Thomas's lines becomes carpeted with Confederate dead and wounded. One Union officer later described the Confederate dead as lying in windrows, stacked like harvested wheat. Yet Cleburne's men continue attacking, driven by courage, leadership, and the knowledge that breakthrough is essential. Thomas's lines hold, but barely. Ammunition begins to run low. Some regiments are down to a handful of cartridges per man. Officers pass orders to hold fire until the enemy is within 50 yards. The situation becomes critical. If Polk can break through here, the entire Union left will collapse, and the army will be cut off from Chattanooga. Rosecrans, at his headquarters a mile behind the lines, can hear the intensity of the fighting on his left, but receives conflicting reports about what's happening. Around 10:30 a.m., he receives a message stating that there is a gap in his line, that General John Brannan's division has somehow been displaced, leaving a hole in the Union defenses. The report is incorrect. Brannan's division is actually in position, but it's positioned slightly behind other units in the tree line and isn't visible to the staff officer who filed the report. Rosecrans, operating on incomplete information and exhausted from 36 hours of battle, makes a catastrophic decision. He orders General Thomas Wood's division to close the supposed gap by moving left. Wood objects, pointing out that there is no gap and that moving his division will create an actual hole in the line. But Rosecrans's order is direct and emphatic. Wood, bitter about having been criticized by Rosecrans earlier in the campaign for not following orders exactly, decides to obey literally. He pulls his entire division out of the line and marches it to the left, creating a quarter-mile gap in the Union defenses. At that exact moment, as if scripted by some malevolent fate, General James Longstreet launches his assault on the Union right. Longstreet has been waiting for hours for Polk's attack to draw Union reserves to the left. Now, at approximately 11:30 a.m., he sends forward 5 divisions in a compact, powerful formation aimed directly at the Union center. Longstreet's 20,000 men advance in a column barely a half-mile wide, a massed formation designed to achieve overwhelming force at a single point. Through pure chance, almost miraculous timing, Longstreet's assault strikes precisely where Wood's division had been positioned minutes before. The Confederates encounter empty forest where they expected to find Union defenses. They pour through the gap like water through a broken dam. Within minutes, Longstreet's divisions are in the Union rear, rolling up the right flank, causing panic and confusion. Union regiments, attacked from unexpected directions, break and run. Artillery batteries are overrun before they can limber their guns and retreat. Entire brigades dissolve into chaos. The Union right flank doesn't bend or fall back. It disintegrates. The breakthrough is complete and devastating. Longstreet's men capture artillery, wagons, thousands of prisoners, and most critically, they cut the Lafayette Road, the main route back to Chattanooga. Rosecrans himself, along with two of his three corps commanders, McCook and Crittenden, are caught up in the panicked retreat. Rosecrans, witnessing what appears to be the complete destruction of his army, rides toward Chattanooga, believing the battle is lost and that his only remaining task is to organize the defense of the city with whatever survivors reach safety. McCook and Crittenden, their corps shattered, also retreat toward Chattanooga. For a brief period, roughly noon to 1 p.m. on September 20th, it appears that the Army of the Cumberland has been destroyed as an effective fighting force. Thousands of Union soldiers stream back toward Chattanooga in disorder, convinced that the battle is lost. Confederate soldiers celebrate what appears to be the most complete victory of the war. Officers report to Bragg that the Union Army is routed and that pursuit will complete its destruction. For perhaps an hour, Chickamauga appears to be a disaster on the scale of Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz. But the battle is not over. On the Union left, George Thomas has not retreated. His corps is still fighting, still holding its positions on Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill, despite having Confederate forces now in its rear as well as its front. Thomas has approximately 25,000 men, about half the original Union Army, and he's now surrounded on three sides with his back to the one remaining escape route. Any reasonable assessment of the situation suggests that Thomas should retreat immediately while escape is still possible. But Thomas doesn't retreat. He receives scattered, fragmentary reports about the disaster on the right. He knows the army is broken. He knows that Rosecrans has abandoned the field. But he also knows that if he retreats now, the panic will worsen and the entire army will be destroyed in the pursuit. Someone must buy time for the broken units to reach Chattanooga, must show the Confederate army that Union forces are still capable of fighting. Thomas chooses to stand. He gathers the remnants of other units that have not fled, positions them on the ridges and hills north of the Lafayette Road, establishes a defensive perimeter, and prepares to hold until nightfall or until his last man falls. What follows is one of the most legendary defensive stands in American military history. From approximately 1 p.m. until darkness falls around 7 p.m., Thomas's corps fights against the entire Confederate army. Longstreet, having broken the Union right, turns north and assaults Thomas's positions from the south and west. Polk's divisions continue attacking from the east and north. Thomas is receiving attacks from three directions simultaneously. Confederate forces outnumber his defenders by more than 2 to 1. He has limited ammunition, no secure supply line, no prospect of reinforcement, and every tactical reason to retreat. Yet his men hold. They establish defensive positions on Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill, using fallen logs and rocks to create improvised breastworks. They fight with the desperation of men who know they're the only thing preventing complete disaster. Regiments that have been fighting since dawn continue fighting into the afternoon. When ammunition runs low, they take cartridges from the dead and wounded. When regiments are reduced to a handful of men, survivors consolidate with other depleted units. Officers fall and sergeants take command. Sergeants fall and corporals lead. And still Thomas holds. The Confederate assaults on Thomas's position come in waves, each more desperate than the last. Bragg senses that complete victory is within grasp if he can break Thomas's resistance and destroy the last organized Union force on the battlefield. He orders attack after attack, throwing division after division against the Union defensive perimeter. Longstreet's troops, exhausted from their morning breakthrough, but sensing the possibility of annihilating the Union army, advance up the slopes of Horseshoe Ridge and Snodgrass Hill. The fighting becomes even more savage than the previous day. At these close ranges, in this dense terrain, artillery is ineffective. This is infantry combat in its most primitive form. Musket against musket, bayonet against bayonet, determination against determination. Confederate soldiers scramble up the ridges, are driven back by Union volleys, reform, and attack again. Some Union positions are overrun in brutal hand-to-hand fighting, only to be retaken minutes later by desperate counterattacks. The slopes become littered with bodies from both armies, wounded men crying for water that no one can bring them, the dead lying in grotesque positions where they fell. Thomas fights like a man possessed. He rides constantly along his defensive line, appearing at critical moments to steady wavering units, directing artillery fire, ordering counterattacks to retake lost positions. His calm demeanor under fire becomes legendary among his soldiers. While shells burst around him and bullets clip branches overhead, Thomas sits on his horse, seemingly oblivious to danger, issuing orders in a quiet voice. His presence alone steadies his troops. If the general isn't worried, they reason, perhaps the situation isn't as desperate as it appears. But Thomas knows exactly how desperate the situation is. His ammunition is running critically low. Some regiments are down to 5 or 10 cartridges per man. His casualties are mounting toward 50% in some units. He has no reserves left to commit. Every available man is in the line. The defensive perimeter is shrinking as flanks are turned and positions become untenable. Yet still he holds buying time with the blood of his soldiers, knowing that every hour his corps stands is an hour closer to nightfall and safety for the broken remnants of the army retreating toward Chattanooga. Around 3 p.m., Union General Gordon Granger makes a decision that saves Thomas and possibly the entire Army of the Cumberland. Granger commands the Reserve Corps, positioned several miles north of the main battlefield, with orders to guard against a possible Confederate flanking movement from that direction. All afternoon, Granger has listened to the sounds of desperate fighting to his south. He has received no orders from Rosecrans, doesn't know what's happening at headquarters, but can tell from the intensity of the combat that something catastrophic is unfolding. He makes the decision to disobey his orders and march toward the sound of the guns. Without authorization, without knowing if Thomas needs help or even if Thomas is still fighting, Granger takes his entire corps, approximately 4,000 fresh troops, and marches south. He arrives at Snodgrass Hill around 3:30 p.m., just as Confederate forces are on the verge of breaking through Thomas's center. Granger's fresh troops, with full ammunition, immediately counterattack and drive the Confederates back. The arrival of Granger's corps is perfectly timed, arriving at the exact moment and place where Union defenses are about to collapse. It's one of those moments in battle where individual initiative changes everything, where one officer's decision to disobey orders and follow his tactical instincts alters the outcome of an entire campaign. The fighting continues with unabated fury through the afternoon. Confederate commanders, frustrated by their inability to break Thomas despite overwhelming numbers, order increasingly reckless frontal assaults. General Bushrod Johnson's division attacks up Snodgrass Hill 6 separate times, each assault bloodier than the last, each time being driven back by Union volleys at point-blank range. Bodies pile up on the slopes until they form obstacles that subsequent attackers must climb over. The Confederate dead lie 3 and 4 deep in some places. Officers lead from the front and die at the head of their regiments. Color bearers, the most dangerous position in any Civil War unit, fall by the dozen. When one color bearer is shot down, another immediately picks up the flag, only to be killed in turn. Some regiments go through 5 or 6 color bearers in a single afternoon. The flags themselves, riddled with bullets torn by shell fragments, become symbols of the desperation and courage on both sides. Yet neither side breaks. The Confederates continue attacking because they sense that one more push will achieve breakthrough. The Union defenders hold because they know that if they break, the entire army will be destroyed. As the sun begins to set around 6:30 p.m., the intensity of the Confederate attacks finally begins to diminish. Bragg's soldiers are exhausted, having fought for 2 days with minimal rest, having made repeated uphill assaults against entrenched positions, having suffered casualties that would have broken lesser armies. Ammunition is running low on both sides. Units are so intermixed and disorganized that officers have lost tactical control. The battlefield is covered with thousands of wounded who need attention. As darkness falls, the Confederate assaults peter out, not because of any decisive repulse, but because the attackers simply cannot continue. Thomas, recognizing that his position is untenable after dark and that he has bought sufficient time for the rest of the army to reach Chattanooga, orders a withdrawal. In remarkably good order considering the circumstances, Thomas's corps disengages from the enemy and begins marching toward Chattanooga. Confederate forces, too exhausted to pursue effectively, let them go. By 8 p.m. the battlefield falls quiet, After 2 days of nearly continuous combat, Chickamauga is over. The immediate aftermath reveals the scale of the carnage. The battlefield is carpeted with over 34,000 casualties, making Chickamauga the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War. The Confederate Army has suffered approximately 18,000 casualties, including 2,312 killed, out of a force of 65,000 men, a casualty rate approaching 30%. The Union Army has suffered approximately 16,000 casualties, including 1,657 killed, out of 58,000 men, a slightly lower percentage but still devastating. These numbers don't capture the true horror. Among the killed and wounded are dozens of generals and colonels, the leadership of both armies. Entire regiments have been reduced to company strength. Some brigades have lost 60 or 70% of their men. The woods are filled with wounded who cannot be moved, who will lie there through the night crying for water, for help, for death to end their suffering. Medical facilities on both sides are completely overwhelmed. Surgeons operate by candlelight, amputating shattered limbs, probing for bullets, making terrible decisions about which men might be saved and which are beyond help. The stretcher bearers work through the night carrying wounded from the battlefield, but they can't reach everyone. Some wounded men will die alone in the forest, undiscovered for days. Bragg has won a tactical victory. He has driven the Union Army from the battlefield, captured artillery and supplies, inflicted heavy casualties, and demonstrated that Confederate forces can still win major battles in the Western theater. But it's a hollow victory that will ultimately contribute to Confederate defeat. His casualties are so severe that he cannot pursue aggressively. His army is too battered to immediately assault Chattanooga's fortifications. Most critically, he has failed to destroy the Union Army, which was his objective. The Army of the Cumberland, though badly mauled, retreats in relatively good order to Chattanooga, where it will regroup, be reinforced, and eventually launch the campaigns that will drive the Confederates from Tennessee and invade Georgia. Bragg has won the battle, but failed to achieve strategic success. The Confederacy cannot afford victories this costly. With every major battle, the South's irreplaceable manpower diminishes while the North's much larger population allows it to absorb losses and rebuild. Chickamauga bleeds the Confederate Army white at the moment when it can least afford such losses. Within 2 months, Bragg's army will be defeated at Chattanooga and driven back into Georgia, setting the stage for Sherman's Atlanta campaign that will help seal the Confederacy's fate. The human cost of Chickamauga extended far beyond the casualty statistics. Among the Union dead were 1,657 soldiers killed in action, with another 2,312 Confederates dead, totaling 3,969 Americans killed in just 2 days of fighting. But these numbers represented individual tragedies, multiplied thousands of times over. The 24th Wisconsin Infantry entered the battle with 450 men and suffered 270 casualties, a 60% loss rate. The 2nd Minnesota lost 205 men out of 384. The Confederate 1st Tennessee lost 228 men out of 425. Behind each of these statistics was a name, a face, a family who would receive a letter or telegram informing them that their son, husband, or father would never return home. Small towns across America, north and south, would be devastated by the losses. Some communities lost entire cohorts of young men, every boy who had enlisted together from the same county. The wounded faced equally tragic fates. Civil War medical care, primitive by any standard, meant that a significant wound often resulted in amputation. Thousands of Chickamauga survivors would spend the rest of their lives as amputees, struggling to earn livings in an era with no disability benefits or veteran services. Others suffered wounds that would kill them slowly over weeks or months from infection. The true death toll from Chickamauga, counting those who died later from wounds or disease contracted during the battle, likely exceeded 5,000. The immediate strategic aftermath saw both armies in precarious positions. The Union Army of the Cumberland retreated into Chattanooga and found itself besieged. Bragg's Confederate Army occupied the high ground surrounding the city, particularly Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain, positions from which Confederate artillery could shell the city and Confederate sharpshooters could fire into Union camps. The Confederates controlled the roads and railroad approaches to Chattanooga, effectively cutting off Union supply lines. Within weeks, the Army of the Cumberland was on starvation rations. Horses and mules died by the thousands from lack of forage. Soldiers survived on quarter rations of hardtack and whatever they could forage. Disease spread through the crowded, unsanitary conditions. For several weeks in October 1863, it appeared that Bragg might achieve through siege what he had failed to achieve through battle. The destruction of the Army of the Cumberland. Union commanders in Washington panicked, fearing that an entire army might be forced to surrender, which would be a catastrophe rivaling the fall of Vicksburg from the Confederate perspective. But the Union's vast advantages in logistics and reinforcements ultimately proved decisive. President Lincoln and General-in-Chief Henry Halleck moved quickly to relieve Chattanooga. They placed General Ulysses S. Grant, fresh from his victories at Vicksburg and throughout the Mississippi campaign, in command of all Union forces in the Western Theater. They rushed reinforcements from Virginia, 20,000 men from the Army of the Potomac under General Joseph Hooker, who made an epic cross-country rail journey in just 11 days. They sent General William T. Sherman with another 17,000 men from Mississippi. They organized a new supply line, the Cracker Line, that reopened supply routes into Chattanooga and ended the starvation conditions. By late November 1863, Grant had over 70,000 well-supplied troops in Chattanooga, facing Bragg's 40,000 increasingly demoralized Confederates. On November 23-25, in the battles of Chattanooga, Grant's forces broke the Confederate siege, capturing Missionary Ridge and Lookout Mountain in a series of assaults that were as stunning as Longstreet's breakthrough at Chickamauga, but with opposite strategic consequences. Bragg's army was routed, driven back into Georgia in disorder, effectively destroyed as an offensive force. Chickamauga's Confederate victory was erased within 2 months. The personal stories emerging from Chickamauga captured both the horror and heroism of the battle. George Thomas earned lasting fame as the Rock of Chickamauga, the general who saved an army through steadfast courage. His defensive stand on Snodgrass Hill entered military legend as one of the greatest rearguard actions in history, studied at West Point and military academies worldwide as an example of how leadership and determination can snatch survival from disaster. Thomas would go on to even greater success, commanding Union forces in the Franklin-Nashville campaign that would destroy another Confederate army. Gordon Granger's decision to march toward the sound of the guns, disobeying orders to follow his tactical instincts, demonstrated the kind of initiative that separates adequate officers from great ones. Colonel John Wilder's brigade, with their rapid-fire Spencer repeating rifles, provided a glimpse of warfare's future, where technology would increasingly determine battlefield outcomes. Countless individual soldiers, whose names were never recorded in history books, performed acts of courage that their comrades never forgot, standing when others fled, rallying broken units carrying wounded comrades from the battlefield under fire. The Confederate victory at Chickamauga came at a cost that the South could not afford and did not lead to the strategic results necessary to justify such losses. Bragg's 18,000 casualties represented nearly 30% of his army and included irreplaceable veteran soldiers and experienced officers. The Confederacy's manpower crisis, already severe by late 1863, became critical after Chickamauga. There were no large pools of recruits to replace the losses. Every regiment that suffered heavy casualties at Chickamauga would be weaker in subsequent battles. More critically, Bragg failed to destroy or even significantly weaken the Union capacity to continue operations in the Western Theater. The Army of the Cumberland was battered but not broken, and the Union's vast resources allowed it to be reinforced and resupplied within weeks. The pattern that had characterized the war became clear at Chickamauga. The Confederacy could win tactical victories, but could not achieve the kind of strategic success that would force the Union to negotiate peace. Each Confederate victory was purchased with casualties the South couldn't replace, while Union defeats were temporary setbacks that could be remedied with more men and material. The legacy of Chickamauga extended far beyond its immediate strategic consequences. It remained for decades the second bloodiest battle of the Civil War, a record that would never be surpassed. The establishment of the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Military Park in 1890, the first national military park in the United States, ensured that the battle would be remembered and studied. Veterans from both sides returned to the battlefield for reunions, walking the ground where they had fought, pointing out to their grandchildren the exact spots where regiments had clashed or where friends had fallen. The reconciliation between North and South, the gradual healing of the nation's wounds, often began at places like Chickamauga, where former enemies could meet as old soldiers sharing memories of combat rather than as antagonists. The battlefield, preserved largely as it was in 1863, became a place of reflection on the cost of war and the courage of those who fought it. The tactical lessons of Chickamauga influenced military thinking for generations. The battle demonstrated the critical importance of terrain, particularly in how the dense forest negated many of the supposed advantages of superior numbers and artillery. It showed how communication failures and fog of war could turn carefully planned operations into chaos. Rosecrans's order creating the gap that Longstreet exploited became a cautionary tale taught to staff officers about the dangers of acting on incomplete information and the necessity of reconnaissance before issuing orders. Thomas's defensive stand became a textbook example of how a well-positioned defensive force could hold against superior numbers if soldiers were properly led and motivated. The battle also demonstrated the limitations of Civil War tactics when attacking fortified positions, foreshadowing the trench warfare that would dominate World War I. The repeated Confederate assaults up Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge, suffering horrific casualties for minimal gains, previewed the futility of frontal assaults against entrenched defenders that would be relearned at terrible cost 50 years later. For the soldiers who fought at Chickamauga, the battle remained the defining experience of their lives. Many wrote memoirs or gave speeches decades later, their memories of those 2 days in the Georgia forests more vivid than anything else they experienced. They remembered the fear, the exhaustion, the chaos of fighting blind in smoke and forest, the screams of the wounded, the faces of friends who fell beside them. They remembered the almost superhuman courage required to stand and fight when every instinct screamed to run, to load and fire when the enemy was barely visible through the smoke, to advance into fire so intense that survival seemed impossible. Some struggled with what today would be called post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by nightmares of the battle. Unable to hear loud noises without flinching, carrying psychological scars that never fully healed. Others found meaning in their service, pride in having endured one of the war's most terrible battles, comfort in the knowledge that they had done their duty when tested. All of them, Union and Confederate alike, had survived or died in a battle that helped determine their nation's future. Chickamauga stands as a testament to the savage nature of the Civil War and the extraordinary courage of the soldiers who fought it. In 2 days in the forests of northwest Georgia, over 34,000 Americans became casualties, with nearly 4,000 killed, in a battle where tactical plans dissolved into chaos and victory was determined by the stubborn courage of individual soldiers fighting desperate battles they could barely understand. The battle changed nothing strategically in the long term. The Confederacy's brief triumph was erased within weeks. But for the men who fought there, for the families who mourned them, for the communities devastated by their losses, Chickamauga was everything. It was where boys became men or died trying, where officers proved or failed their mettle, where the terrible cost of the war became personal and immediate. The name Chickamauga, the Cherokee word for river of death, proved prophetic. The creek that gave the battle its name ran red with blood for days after the fighting ended, and the fields and forests became killing grounds where thousands fell. They deserve to be remembered not just as casualties in a forgotten battle, but as individuals who gave everything in a cause they believed in a moment when their nation called and they answered, whatever the cost.